Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Today we start 2 John, chapter 1. Don't be deceived. Inflection brought to you by Rabbi Michael Skobac. How are you today?
Baruch Hashem, thank God. Today is the day we start 2 John, and it's the day that we finish 2 John.
How about that, man? Grand slam in one hit. Excellent. All right. So let's get this baby knocked out of the park.
Yeah, this 2 John and 3 John are the shortest books, if you can call it that, letters in the whole Christian Bible.
I call it a post-it.
What's that?
It's a post-it note.
Yeah, it's not even a letter, it's a post-it.
Yes. Okay. It's all yours. Take it away, boss.
So, we only have a few verses. This is the whole 2 John. It begins, it sounds like a line from a Led Zeppelin song. It says basically I think I'm reading from the New American Standard translation. The elder to the chosen lady and her children. The elder to the chosen lady and her children, whom I love in truth. And not only I, but also all who know the truth. So the writer here refers to himself as the elder. That's okay. And traditional Christians assume that this is the same person who authored the Gospel of John and the same person who authored 1 John, which we just finished last week. There's no solid evidence for this. Again, these books in the Christian scriptures are written anonymously. There are lots of traditions about who the actual author is. So this is the traditional view, that the same person who composed the Gospel of John is the same person who authored this letter. But again, there's no real proof or evidence for this, and we may never really know who the actual author is. So this elder writes to the chosen lady. That's a bit of a mysterious, what does this mean, the chosen lady? So some commentaries, Christian commentaries, assume that this letter was written to a particular woman, to this particular chosen lady. Other commentaries suggest that this is really a coded, veiled reference to a particular local church. So somehow the chosen lady is really a symbolic term, meaning that this is the church that he's addressing. And he, not only to this chosen lady, but to her children. So obviously, either to this particular woman's actual children or to the members of this particular church. Now, it's hard to know which interpretation makes more sense. Normally, you go with the simplest explanation, which would be he's writing to a woman. But it seems to me, if I can just throw my 2 cents in, that the second interpretation might make a little bit more sense, because the writer here qualifies, this identification. The writer says, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. Now, you can understand how, if it was simply him writing to a particular woman, he would say, whom I love in truth. He's writing to a woman that he knows in truth. But then he goes on to say, not only I, but also all who know the truth. So why would all of these people who know the truth, why would they love a particular woman and her children. It's probably unlikely that everyone who knows the truth would even be aware or know this particular woman and her children. So it may be more likely to assume that he's speaking about a church community, and that as a church community, there's more of a reputation, more well known, and then it would make more sense to speak about, everyone who knows the truth is somehow connected or loves this congregation. David Stern, in his commentary here, he has this Jewish New Testament commentary. So he suggests that the writer wrote here in code. He's writing in a sort of a secret code, a surreptitious code, to escape the Roman censors. And that's why he speaks about this congregation as a chosen lady and doesn't say straight out congregation. I think this is a weak argument. I'm not saying it's weak to suggest that he's sort of using symbolic language to speak about a congregation as this beloved woman, but I don't really buy the idea that he was doing this to escape Roman censors. First of all, there's no evidence that the Roman authorities were paying careful attention to letters that were written by, people part of the church. There's no evidence that the Roman authorities censored Christian texts. That would really play havoc with the early church documents. It's interesting that the church very heavily censored rabbinic writings, and it became a whole issue about what does the actual text really say. And fortunately, you could say this, that Jewish communities were spread all over the world, so that there were Jewish communities in Islamic lands where the Islamic authorities did not censor these texts, and we were able to more or less reconstruct what the original texts were. But I don't know if there's any evidence at all that the Romans really were reading these Christian letters and texts so carefully and that they were censoring them. And the other problem is that why in the world would this particular verse, this particular passage, warrant the need to, cover up what is actually being said? Meaning that the passage itself seems fairly innocuous. It's just mentioning a particular church and his advice to this church. There are other passages in the Christian Bible that would have been much more provocative to the Romans and wouldn't have to undergo any kind of camouflage. This particular verse here, I don't think needs the camouflage. It would seem that if you want to make the argument that the writers were concerned about Roman censorship, there would have been many, many other passages that could have, perked up the ears of the Roman readers. So I just find this idea a little bit far-fetched. David Stern claims to have further evidence for this clandestine writing of this passage at the beginning of 2 John, because he points us to verse 12 towards the end of this letter, where the author says, "I'd rather not use paper and ink." So David Stern takes this to mean, I've got to be careful about what I say. I'd rather not write this down. It's very sensitive information. So he says that that's the further proof that the author here is trying to avoid Roman eyes and Roman censorship. Again, I think this idea is just poorly conceived, meaning that if the writer here was really concerned about the censors, So to say that I'd rather not write this in paper, I'd rather not write this, it's sort of a red flag. Like he's calling attention to the letter, right? When you say in the letter itself, I'd rather not be writing this, you're raising suspicions. The second thing is that if you read verse 12 in its entirety, the writer explains exactly what he means by saying that I would rather not use paper and ink. He says, having many things to write to you, meaning that I've got a lot to really discuss with you, I do not want to do so with paper and ink because I hope to come to you and speak face to face. Meaning that he's saying that, I could save myself a lot of trouble. I don't need to write everything down. There's a lot to discuss. And when I come to you, I'll be able to just have this discussion face to face. Now, this may have some bearing, again, on our question about who is being spoken of here. Is he saying that when I come to you, I want to speak to you face to face? Does it make more sense to say that that's speaking about a particular individual, a particular woman? Or is it just another way of saying that he wants to speak to the church community face to face? You could say that it might go either way. It may not be a slam dunk truth either way. So in verse 3, the writer goes on and says, grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus the Messiah, the Son of the Father, in truth and love. So again, we've had this discussion numerous times. The writer obviously does not clearly state that Jesus is God. That's obvious here. That's clear here. The writer here seems to be distinguishing between the Creator and the Messiah. Right? He says, from God the Father and from Jesus the Messiah. There's no implication that Jesus is God. There's a distinguishing in the text between God the Father and Jesus the Messiah, who he refers to as the Son of the Father. Now, again, to say that someone is the Son of the Father or the Son of God very, very obviously does not mean that they are God. In the Tanakh, we have many, many times when individuals or people are referred to as Son of God. So, for example, in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, Israel, the entire people, are called God's firstborn son. Or you find, for example, that God refers to Solomon, to Shlomo, as his son. So clearly there's no implication that being son of God the Father, Son of God the anything, makes you equivalent to God. It makes you God as well. So again, all you see in verse 3 is the mentioning of God the Father, right, the Creator, and who the writer considers to be the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who he says is Son of the Father, in truth and in love. Now, again, this is consistent with what we've seen regularly in the Christian Bible. I mean, I've tried to point out, as we've gone along, all the places where the writers distinguish between Jesus and God. And again, I think that the reason is that as the Christian scriptures were written, I do not believe at that point there was a doctrine of Jesus being God. I think there was clearly a belief that Jesus was some kind of intermediary to God, that somehow you were able to get to God through Jesus. But I don't believe that during the formative years when these documents were being composed, there was the belief yet that Jesus was God in the flesh. And again, all you have here is the assertion that Jesus is the Messiah. There's zero evidence here or anywhere else in the Christian Bible that Jesus was the Messiah. All you have is this repeated assertion. And it's almost mind-numbing. It's like, I can't tell you how many times I've been on social media where some Christian just sort of breaks into a discussion or makes this random comment to a video or to a posting where they just say, Jesus is the Messiah. Like, why is there this constant need to just make this assertion, to make this claim? I think that I think that the reality is that it's a belief that people have despite the fact that there's zero evidence. And actually the evidence goes counter to the belief. There is no evidence that Jesus was the Messiah. All the evidence points away from him being the Messiah. All Christians are left with is this need to constantly reinforce in their own minds that this is the truth, that Jesus is the Messiah. And I suspect that they feel that by just repeating it enough, it sort of makes it true. So that's what you have in verse 3. In verse 4, the writer says, I was very glad to find some of your children walking in truth, just as we have received commandment to do from the Father. Now, again, when you listen to this verse carefully, I was very glad to find some of your children walking in truth. So the language here in this chapter, in this verse as an example, is clearly a personal letter. The language here is clearly of a personal letter. Again, there's no claim by the writer that he's received this from God. There's no claim to this being a prophecy. There's no claim to any kind of divine inspiration. There's someone who's written a letter, either to an individual or to a group. And it seems very clear, if you just read the language, that that's all you have here. With the clearest proof of this is verse 12. The writer says, I'm just going to jump ahead. He says, let me read it out of here. This is going to be, I think, an NIV. He says, I have much to write to you. I have much to write to you, but I do not want to use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to visit you and talk with you face to face so that our joy may be complete. There's so obvious that this is simply a personal letter, a personal communication. And it's interesting that the John MacArthur Study Bible, which is a very conservative evangelical tool. So he writes in his introduction to 2 John, he says, 2nd and 3rd John present the closest approximation in the New Testament to the conventional letter form of the contemporary Greco-Roman world, since they were addressed from an individual to individuals. That even MacArthur seems to just take note of the fact that the style here is of a personal communication, a personal letter, the kind of letter that you would drop into a mailbox. In verse 5, there's an emphasis in verse 5 on the commandment to love one another. Now, when we looked at 1 John, we ran across repeated exhortations to keep God's commandments. He kept on talking about the importance of keeping God's commandments. And back then, we asked if this was speaking about the 613 commandments of the Torah, or was it referring to, let's say, the more localized commandments of the Christian Bible, which would have been basically to love one another, and to share the gospel with the entire world. I mean, there are not lots of commandments that you find in the Gospels. So I suggested that maybe all he's talking about is, the commandment to love one another. But then here in verse 6, he says, this is love. This is love. What is love? That we walk according to his commandments. So it seems from here that it's not so simple. That the idea of keeping God's commandments cannot be reduced, boiled down to simply loving one another. It seems that he's referring to God's commandments, something that's more broad than simply loving one another. And then again, we come back to the question, what exactly are these commandments that he's referring to? I mean, it's nice that the writer keeps on talking about the importance of keeping God's commandments, but it's very, very far from clear. He does not help us understand what he means by keeping God's commandments. Is it just the 10 commandments? Is that what he's referring to? Is it the entire 613 commandments? Is he referring to just the non-ceremonial and spiritual commandments, right? Like he's doing away with the dietary laws and the laws of the Sabbath and the laws of the temple, and he's only speaking about laws that have something to do with our relationship with other people. It's not clear what he's referring to here, unfortunately. In verse 7, the writer says, now, what happens is the author here slides into a theme that is brought up over and over and over again in the epistles and in the letters of the Christian scriptures. I mean that, the letter started off it sounding, sweet enough and nice enough, but in verse 7 he gets to business, gets down to brass tacks, and he begins addressing what for him is a very, very critical, and sensitive issue, which is basically, and again, it's not just here, it's throughout all the letters and epistles, it is warnings about deceivers and false teachers. Over and over and over again, you get this concern about the deceivers and the false teachers. And I've pointed out in the past that it's very hard to understand how it's possible that in just a few decades, this is not, not talking hundreds of years here after Jesus died, when maybe it's not so hard to imagine splintering of the Christian world. This is just a few decades after the crucifixion. And already by this time, whatever Jesus taught became such a confusing jumble that quality control is in crisis mode, meaning that this concern about false teachers and deceivers, it's not just something that comes up once or twice in the Christian Bible. It's literally in virtually every single letter, every single epistle. It gives the impression that it was the Wild West back then in terms of, what's the truth? What did Jesus really teach? Right? Who's right and who's wrong? In this verse, the deceivers are described as people who do not acknowledge that the Messiah, Jesus, came in the flesh. Now, obviously, these are not people who deny that Jesus existed. They don't deny that he was the Messiah, but there's something about denying that he came in the flesh. Now, this is it's a hard concept to wrap your head around. It seems to be some kind of Gnostic belief. that really denies the humanity of Jesus. I mean, that orthodox, traditional, normative Christian belief tries to walk this tightrope where they see Jesus as both fully human and fully divine. And it seems, at least, that here the writer is concerned about people who deny the humanity of Jesus. They somehow, they would insist that, the Jesus that walked the earth was not really a human being. It was more of a, some kind of a ghost, maybe, I don't know. But it was God that appeared like a human. Maybe that's the way to describe it, that it was God who appeared to be human but really wasn't. Some kind of an angel, an angelic appearance. But that's what it seems to be referring to here. And it's interesting that, this view, which is a very, if you wanted to find something in the Christian Bible that, sort of asserts the divinity of Jesus, this would be that kind of a view, meaning so much so that they deny the humanity of Jesus. But again, here, the writer is branding this kind of belief heretical, right? This is deception. And the writer actually calls this deceiver an antichrist, right? That's how, abhorrent this view is to the writer of this chapter. So, interestingly, in 1 John, in the letter of 1 John, this term of antichrist was reserved for people who did not believe that Jesus is the Messiah, people who deny the messiahship of Jesus, or people who deny that Jesus is the Son of God. Here, the term antichrist is being used basically as someone who has an unorthodox view of who Jesus was, meaning that they don't acknowledge his humanity. Now, in verse 8, again, continuing with this concern about deceivers, the author warns the readers. Now, again, we don't know who the readers of this letter are. Is it the individual woman who is being addressed, or is it a reference to a particular church community? But the author is warning either her or them about the danger of losing their accomplishments and their reward. Meaning that apparently the author believes that these were good Christians, but their spiritual status is in danger. It seems, as we're going to see in further development of this letter, that the concern here is about the hospitality that was being offered to these deceivers. That apparently this is really what was driving the concern of the letter writer, that the author of the letter is seeing that either a particular woman and her family are hosting some deceiver or deceivers, or that somehow they're even able to infiltrate an entire church community and take advantage of their hospitality. Again, this goes back to the question that we raised at the beginning of the chapter: who is being warned? Is the author warning a particular family or a particular congregation? Right? This is all, everything hinges on that question. In verse 9, the author says, if someone does not follow the doctrine of the Messiah, they don't have God. So somehow, it's really not clear what it means by saying following the doctrine of the Messiah. Does it mean the doctrine of who the Messiah is? Does it mean the doctrines taught by the Messiah? So it's not 1,000,000% clear. But the writer says here, if you do not follow the doctrine of the Messiah, you do not have God. You basically are out of fellowship with God. You don't have a relationship with God. Again, this is something that was asserted many times in First John, and again, that is found in the Gospel of John, right? That no one comes to the Father except through me, except through the Son. And this idea that we cannot have a relationship with God without Jesus, we have seen is a totally unbiblical idea that we see throughout the Tanakh. We got everybody has a relationship with God without Jesus, right? Everyone from Adam and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Aaron and Miriam, right? Joshua and all the judges and all the prophets and Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc. Everyone has a relationship with God. They know God. They live righteously before God. They pray to God. God answers their prayers. Then they have there's no connection of Jesus. There's not even a connection to any Messiah, any messianic idea. There's simply nothing in the Tanakh which says that you cannot have a relationship with God without the Messiah. It's just never taught. It's an unbiblical idea. It violates logic because, again, we see that everyone in the Tanakh knows God and does not know Jesus. So this, again, is as I mentioned before, a irrational and a pernicious idea. In verse 10, the writer says, "Do not bring them into your house and don't greet them." Don't even say hello to these people. So you can see that there's some kind of a serious concern here. There's a serious concern about either this family or this community, this church community, exposing themselves to these deceivers. And in verse 11, the author says, if you greet him, you participate in his evil deeds. But somehow, if you even say hello, if you even greet these deceivers, you are basically partnering with whatever evil they're up to. You're sort of giving them credibility. Maybe that's one way of looking at it. I mean, it's interesting that I've mentioned here in the past that for many, many, many years, I've been going to some of the major Messianic conferences in the United States, the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. Maybe some of the listeners even have met me there in the past. And their attitude towards myself and my colleagues was basically very similar to the tone of this chapter. There were constant warnings. People were constantly being warned not to speak to us. Don't talk to these people. They're anti-missionaries, whatever. They're wolf in sheep's clothing. It's unbelievable. So there were all these efforts to basically ignore us, to have people intimidated against speaking to us. I'll never forget that when I was in Dallas, this is maybe in, maybe the mid-90s, they actually had a security force that they hired to follow us around, not to intimidate us, but they thought that if their security force was hanging around us, it would intimidate the people from the conference from being seen near us. And I remember one day I was walking in the hotel lobby and a bellhop came up, it's right out of a spy movie. He came up behind me and he put a matchbook in my hand. It was very cool. So I open up the matchbook and it says, please meet me in room 529 in 5 minutes. So there was someone from the conference who wanted to speak with me, but was afraid of doing so in public because that was the. Now it was interesting that over time, the conference organizers started to realize that this is not a great strategy, that it's sending a very, very negative message. It's basically saying that we're afraid and we're intimidated, and somehow we have to, make sure that we control who you speak to. And I remember the fellow that sent me this message, when I came up to his room, he said, when I came to this conference, he said to me, I had no intention of speaking to you. He said, I came here to meet girls, because he was a single guy. And probably where he lived, there were not many Messianic Jews. So here was a big conference. He came to meet women. But he said to me, he said, I grew up in Russia. And he said, this is before the fall of the Soviet Union. And he said, in Russia, they would try to tell us what we can read, who we can speak to. So he said, that's how I grew up. And he said, last night, they made everyone in the conference stand up and take a public oath that none of us would speak to you. And he said, at that point, I said to myself, to hell with them. I'm going to make it a point of speaking to you. But again, he was still intimidated from doing it publicly. So, of course, it's always far too easy to dismiss uncomfortable ideas by shooting the messenger and painting the messenger as an evil deceiver, right? That's a very, easy thing to do when the messenger might be bearing information that's uncomfortable. The truth is that maybe these people are deceivers. Maybe they are evil. But on the other hand, maybe they have some important truth for you to learn. And that's always the $64,000 question. When you become part of any religious movement, the leaders, the shepherds, they feel that they have to protect their flock. And so the question is, how far do they take that? Do you take it to the point where you really literally try to control what people read, control who people speak to? Obviously, you cannot exert complete control over people. And I suspect that most human beings that have some kind of a brain at some point will kick back and say, what are you so afraid of? Why do you have so little faith in my own ability to listen to other ideas and to make a decision for myself? And that's always the problem. When does the leader, when do the shepherds take this responsibility of protecting their flock? When do they push it too far? On the other hand, how do you get people that are in such a environment, people that are part of a group that tries to censor what they hear and tries to censor what they read and tries to censor who they speak to? How do you get people to open their minds to consider another perspective? Debate teams, when I was in high school, I was on the debating team. So you had to be able to argue for both sides of an issue, right? It wasn't simply that you put yourself in a cocoon and you only knew one side of a topic and you were only able to argue that side, and you really didn't even know what the other point of view was, right? It's just that whatever they shot at you, you had to somehow shoot it down. That's really not ideal. Ideally, you have to be able to engage with other points of view. And if you really do have the truth, you have to be able to know, right, how to answer. You have to be able to know how to respond to them. Otherwise, it could very well be that what you swallowed initially isn't the truth. And, maybe you cross the street without looking both ways. So now you find yourself part of a group that is trying to control what kind of ideas you consume, and they want very much to protect you from hearing anything else because they're afraid that if you do, you may reconsider. But to be a human being means that you have to be able to consider. You have to be able to look both ways before you cross a street. You need to be able to get a second opinion before you make a final decision. And leaders always feel responsible for their flocks, but the individual needs to be very careful not to be a sheep. And they need to do their own due diligence to make sure that what they believe is true. The reality is that most people in life believe whatever they were raised to believe. Most people do not go on a careful spiritual search to determine the truth. If you basically scratch most people, they believe what they were raised to believe, which is not a great sin. It's not a huge problem. That's normal, right? Normally, if parents believe something, they should try to pass that on to their children. In some ways, it's a healthy system. On the other hand, it all depends upon how that system got started. So if we assume that the origins of that belief are rooted in truth, so for example, in Torah, in Judaism, right, we have a foundation which we believe is true, that God spoke to 3 million people at Mount Sinai, and it's not just something that we happen to believe, it's something that we know, right? As it says in Deuteronomy chapter 4, Atah haresel adas, you showed us so that we should know. We don't have to say we have faith and that we believe. We know what's true because God demonstrated with crystal clear clarity that he's real and that the Torah he was giving us is true. But if you belong to a spiritual system where there's no evidence, it's just all based upon belief. There's no evidence that the Gospels came from God. These are just people that are claiming that God spoke to them, or Paul. Paul claims that what he's writing is from God. But how do we know? So it would seem to me that if you are part of a spiritual system where if you go all the way back, it's not based upon knowledge, it's not based upon evidence, it's based simply upon belief, it seems to me that you have a right to examine those beliefs and to think about them. So it's important for a person not to be a sheep. Again, going back to verse 12, the writer, this is the third time we're coming to this verse, the writer says, having many things to write to you, I don't want to do so with paper and ink, but I have to come to you and speak face to face, that your joy may be made full. So the implication here is that it's this kind of hospitality, right? That's the only legitimate kind of hospitality, meaning that the writer is saying, do not host these deceivers because they're just going to confuse your mind. Wait till I come, right? And I can fill your mind with the truth. So that's what he's basically saying. He's saying that these other people, they're deceivers, right? Like in the Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain. Don't ignore the man behind the curtain. So that's what the writer here is saying. Saying, ignore those deceivers who claim to have the truth about Jesus. You'll just wait. I'll show up. We'll have our face-to-face discussion. And that's the kind of experience that will bring you joy. Your joy will be full. Again, this is the comfortable echo chamber of like-minded believers. This is the world we're living in today, that people surround themselves in their echo chamber. They only listen to people who believe the same things, reinforce the same ideas. They very carefully shield themselves from anything that might challenge their beliefs. And, which again, it's comfortable, but at the end of the day, people have to ask themselves, do I really know that what I believe is true? Have I really examined it from both sides, right? Normally in life, when there's a decision to be made where the implications, the consequences for your decision are significant, are consequential, you want to make a informed decision. You want to look both ways before you cross the street. You want to get a second opinion if your doctor says that we're going to have to amputate your leg. That's what we do. It's normal that people should have the opportunity to make sure that what they believe is true, to check it out. That's what Isaiah says. Come, let us reason together, right? I don't think that blind faith is ever held up as a virtue. Blind faith can be more blind than faith. So we have to have a solid foundation for what we believe. It's important, Maimonides says, not so much to believe, but to know. We have to know certain things. And knowledge and belief have to be based upon reasons and evidence. And there has to be reasons to believe that which we believe. Otherwise, it's blind faith. And when you are dealing with blind faith, you can end up believing anything. So basically, that's really all I had to share about this short little chapter.
All right.
We'll find that 3rd John is short, is small. And then I think we get to the book of Jude, if I'm not mistaken. And then I think after that we get to Revelation, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
That sounds good. Sounds like we're rolling right along. And then we'll double back, of course, to Mark, Luke, and Bad John.
Yeah, you're not going to get rid of me so fast, William. We're going to be here it's going to take us a few years to get through those other 3 Gospels.
They're quite messy. Gotcha. Very good. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi. Always a pleasure. Enjoy your lectures as usual. And so thank you all for watching and tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Turn on all notifications. There's a bell there. Click the all button, and you'll be notified with everything. So y'all have a great week. Rabbi, much love, and we'll see you on the...
Happy 4th of July.
Yes, happy 4th of July. Today is the 4th, right? Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm an expat. I'm an American that's living in Canada now for a long time, but I still seem to recall that July 4th is an important day. Mm-hmm. And so happy 4th of July to all my American friends.
Awesome. That's awesome. I'm one of them.
You are one of them.
Thank you. All right, guys. Y'all have a great week. Thank you, Rabbi. See you soon. Take care, everybody.
God bless you.
Take care. Bye.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד